Welcome back, everyone, to the Nauzecast. I'm your host, Nauze, and I have today here with me my good friend Frickles, a ridiculously prolific author in the Harry Potter fandom with over 10 stories written and half more complete. He is most known for A Simple Act of Vengeance and its sequel, as well as A Malignant Ruse to his chagrin. He's going through a challenge of writing a one-shot per month with unusual pairings in the fandom, and has delivered the single best Sully fic I have ever read. Thank you for joining us, Frickles. How are you today?
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm doing very well, thanks.
Awesome. So, how old were you when you started reading fanfiction, and how long ago that was?
Oh gosh, it was a long time ago. I think that I was probably in my early teens, and I started with anime fanfiction.
Which one?
Gundam Wing and Escaflowne.
Escaflowne, I don't know, but Gundam Wing was was one from my childhood for sure. And
yeah,
how did you find the fanfiction at the time?
How did I find it? I found it. I used fanfiction.net.
No, but I mean, someone indicated you, or did you search it? Or
I think I just searched it, and there's only one fic that I recall from those days, and it was this brilliant romance from the Escaflowne fandom, and I actually went and searched the name. It was called "What a Rainbow Feels Like," and it's a completely
weird.
It's a completely alternate universe fic. It has nothing to do with the anime except for the characters. And it was it's magnificent. Even to this day, it holds up.
Oh,
and
that's impressive.
That was really kind of the last that I read of any fan fiction. I read for maybe a year and a half, 2 years, and then life moved me forward, and I kind of forgot about it until Harry Potter.
How does a rainbow feel? How long was it? The story itself?
I want to say it was 10 to 15 chapters, maybe 50,000 words.
Substantial. Okay.
Right, it wasn't an epic by any means, but it was good. Very very well written romance.
And what made you do the jump from reader to writer when you started A Simple Act of Vengeance?
Well, I wanted to talk about how I found Harry Potter fan fiction because
sorry.
Because I actually never read the books when they came out, and I never saw any of the movies. And I was doing my undergraduate degree, and my best friend at the time was a huge Harry Potter fan.
Oh boy.
He would do Harry Potter trivia contests and all that, and just very
that sounds amazing.
He was one of those hardcore fans, and he told me, he said, you're my best friend. This is something that's really important to me, and you never read it. You don't know anything about it, so I want you to read the series. So on spring break one year, these foreign students wanted to go to Disneyland, and they didn't have driver's licenses in America, so they paid me to drive them to Florida. And
at the time,
I drove them there.
You were living where? So, I have a frame of reference.
I was living in the Southwest United States, not too far from where Firefawn lives. If I remember that, if I remember the podcast with her.
So a few days of trip.
Yeah, it was a 27-hour drive.
Jesus Christ!
And I drove them out there, and I had nothing to do because I didn't want to go to Disneyland, and I didn't pay for any tickets or anything. So I was just there for a week waiting. And so I brought all 7 Harry Potter books, and I read them in a week.
Oh, that's awesome.
And this was 2 or 3 years after Deathly Hallows came out, so the craze was over, and I hated it. I did not like Harry Potter.
The character or the book? Or both?
The book. So I came back and I told my friend, I said, I'm just not a fan of this. I thought it was, I thought the ending was terrible. I thought that the last book, it was she just wrapped it up because the story needed to end, not because she had actually planned anything out. And he said, we should probably watch the movies, because a lot of people like the movies. So
he might make it better.
So he put in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, U.S. version.
Yeah.
So we're watching this movie, and I happened to take a lot of psychedelic mushrooms before watching this.
Fantastic. Best thing possible to do when watching a magical movie.
Oh, so I was tripping balls, and and we're watching it, and the first thing I said was, "I can't believe how British they are." And he was like, "Yeah, it's British actors. The series is set in England or in Scotland." And I was like, "All right." And so we're watching it, and he looks over like halfway through, and I'm like sobbing, and he's like, "What's the matter now?" I was like, it's just so sad that Harry never got any Christmas presents. So,
I should try that once. That sounds good.
So, I hardly recommend it. It made it amazing. But suffice to say, my relationship with Harry Potter isn't quite what I think a lot of fans is. But that being said, I was so dissatisfied with the ending that, like, a lot of other people who are involved in fan fiction, I wanted to... Mm-hmm. I was interested in reading something that I felt would tie it together more effectively. So that was how I found Harry Potter fan fiction, which was probably, 7-8 years after, probably even longer than I found, the anime fan fiction back in the day. Mm-hmm. And after that, I read for maybe like a story every 3 or 4 months, from then on until present.
Oh, so not like a very avid reader.
No, not at all.
Mm-hmm. What made you want to start writing instead of just reading?
It was entirely COVID. I was doing my PhD, and I was teaching a class at a university. And COVID, the shutdown hit in the middle of the semester. So the university told all of the teachers, they said, we're going to give you 2 weeks. So you have spring break and 1 week after spring break in order to completely change your class from in-person to online only.
Oh, Jesus.
So I thought it was going to be a really difficult thing, but, I had designed the curriculum. I had the syllabus planned out. So it took me about 8 or 9 days to do all the lectures recorded, or to get all the lectures recorded.
Oh, that was quick.
Modify all the assignments. And then for the rest of the semester, while my students, I would dole out the lectures and the assignments as needed, but I had essentially
done.
I don't know, almost 3 months, where yeah, exactly. I didn't have to, go into class 3 times a week and teach. I wasn't meeting with my dissertation committee because we couldn't meet in person. And so I had all this free time, and I thought, maybe I should just write a story. Work-life balance had been a real issue for me during my studies. And I felt like I didn't have any hobbies and I didn't do anything for myself. So I just, one night, I wrote the first chapter of A Simple Act of Vengeance. I posted it the next day once my, fan fiction account, you have to wait 24 hours.
Oh, yeah? I don't remember.
Yeah, you can't publish the same day you make an account.
Okay, yeah. Probably.
So I published it the next day, and that was it.
That's awesome. It was back in April 2020.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And when you started writing, did you focus on something at first, or you went ahead as if it was an essay or something? And do you wish you knew something that you know now at the time?
I had an outline that I put together in like a half an hour when I first started. Mm-hmm. And it was supposed to be 25 chapters or so.
Sure.
And and of course, it ended up being 51 chapters, so more than double. But I just thought like, I really want to write this Voldemort fight, and that's it. Like, that was all I wanted, was the fight.
The meteor.
Exactly. So I kind of just thought, well, like, I've got to get to that point. I don't want to just have it be like something silly that's obviously only in, not a real story at all, just a fight. So I had to create this whole background story, and that ended up being a lot more fun than the actual fight. But you asked if there was something I wish I knew when I started. And I had such a hard time with dialogue, writing dialogue. There's this rhythm to writing a conversation, and I struggled with it so much. And if you go back and read the first 10 chapters of A Simple Act of Vengeance, it's just a mess. Like, no one talks like that in real life. So that took me some time. And I think the way that I got past it was, I would speak out loud the conversations, like what like if it was inside quotation marks, I would say it out loud before I published it. And that helped me think like, this is terrible.
It's funny. Phoenix mentioned the same thing in the last podcast. I know I haven't listened to it yet, but he said exactly the same thing. Read all your dialogues out loud. It will make it better. It's good advice. It's a good advice, yeah, for sure.
But there's so much that I'm still learning every day about writing. There's these general truths. Like if you ask people who are involved in the Harry Potter fandom, the fan fiction community, they'll tell you things like, "Oh, well, tropes are bad," and that's just not true. Like, and I think that we get so caught up in what we assume, like the most hardcore of readers want, that it ends up negatively affecting our stories. So, when you learn about, go ahead.
The reason most people call a certain trope bad or something, it's because it's the same thing with cliches. Once it's overdone in a bad way, people tend to connect the bad things to the genre instead of separating what's good and what's bad. So they all get lumped together. So tropes are a bad thing in everyone's mind. Well, most people's mind, because they only see the bad sides instead of the good ones. So yeah,
that's a great point. You're right. We never think like, oh, this is a trope when it's something we're enjoying. It's only when we see something that's poorly executed that we say, oh, this is stupid and tropey.
Yep. Like Lord of the Rings is basically the hero's journey. It's a trope. It's old-fashioned as fuck, but people love it. It's a great masterpiece. Probably won't ever be a book as well written as the Tolkien universe, because it was a master. But it's still a trope.
Yeah, absolutely. You could boil down almost every story to some trope or another.
Has any of your professional or academic experience, you mentioned that you taught, you had classes and were doing your PhD, has any of it helped you in any way as far as writing goes?
Academia was no help whatsoever.
Seriously?
No,
I assume so, because like you're so clean in your writing. Because I thought that actually helped.
No, I think that I'm a good writer because I spent most of my life as a voracious reader. If you want to be a good writer, read.
Know what's out there.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not even just about like stories and story structure. If you read a lot, your vocabulary improves, your grammar improves, your sentence structure improves.
You get new ideas. You know what's good, what works, what doesn't.
Right. As far as academia, like I've published a journal article, and it was incredibly boring. What
was the theme about? Can I ask?
It was about advertising in mobile games. But it's totally different. Like I don't think that there is
different beast. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's not much parallels. I did work as a copywriter in marketing before I went back to graduate school, and I would say that helped me a little bit as far as the idea of kind of like cadence, like writing something that's pleasing to your eyes. If that makes sense.
For sure.
So there was some benefit in that regard. Yeah.
I know you come up with so many ideas because you have to, considering how many stories you have. So, what is your process for defining what is a good enough idea that you can keep and use? And how do you come up with them?
I get ideas from everywhere. And I know that's such a stereotypical response.
Yeah.
That's a non-answer. But for example, in Living Company, which is my Sue Lee one-shot, the entire story emerged from a throwaway joke in the TV show Arrested Development. A single line from a sitcom, a TV comedy, that I was watching it and I laughed, and it just kind of, I thought about that joke like a couple days later, and I knew I had wanted to write a Sue Lee one shot. And so I thought, that joke made me laugh, and I wonder if I could.
The joke was?
It's the dictee.
Ah, okay. Okay.
So, in the show, one of the characters goes to a store called, I think it's Ancient Chinese Secret. That's the name of the show, or the store, I believe. And there's a very cliche dressed Asian man, and the character, who is like a wealthy white guy, asks for something to put the tingle in his dingle, and he keeps his voice very low, and he mocks the shop owner, and kind of talks down to him, and so the shop owner calls out in a really loud voice, "Dong Ti," to embarrass him. And I just thought of that like kind of situation of this because the Asian man, obviously, it was set in America. He's doing this as kind of like a marketing gig, or he wants to appear authentic, but at the same time he's selling this like kind of dumb item, like tea to help your your downstairs region.
Yep.
And I thought, like, okay, we don't see a lot of diversity in the magical world in Harry Potter, and so it wouldn't be that much of a leap, for a character to have that same attitude of, I'm just gonna, these people have no idea what what being Chinese is like. So
it's very British centered.
But I mean, in a more general, so that's like one idea how it came to be. A single joke turned into a 25,000 word story. But once I have an idea, I just start crafting conflict. And if I can't come up with anything interesting or compelling, I just put the idea aside until I can. If I do come up with something, then I run with it right away, which is why I have a million unfinished stories.
They're on their way. And when you do get your ideas, do you brainstorm with it? And how is the brainstorming? Do you do it in sessions, in spurts? How do you do it?
It varies depending on the story. And
also,
it depends on how seriously I take the story. So, for example, this will make probably people unhappy, but a Malignant Ruse, I don't think about it very much. The same with A Graceless Tandem, which was my honks pairing. I didn't think about them very much, and so I just sat down and wrote them out. Like A Graceless Tandem, I remember, I think I wrote 5 chapters in 5 days.
Yeah,
because I just sat down and I was just like, whatever.
I remember.
Yeah, and A Malignant Ruse is kind of the same thing. Like, I didn't have to think very hard about it. So there's very little brainstorming. Like, I would just think to myself, I haven't written this story in a while, and I would sit down and write the chapter in 4 or 5 hours. When it's something like Wrath and Remorse or The Lost Continent, I spend probably 12 hours brainstorming for every hour that I spend writing. Those stories are so much more complex.
Sure.
I care about them a lot, so I want to do my best to make them as clean and tight as possible. And I just brainstorm all the time, when I'm walking my dog, when I'm at work, when I'm making coffee, it'll just come into my head and I'll start thinking like, what's going to happen next in this story? How am I going to get to X, Y, or Z? So I think that's how I do it.
Do you outline more, or are you more of a discovery writer, or a mix of both?
I'd say I'm more more of a discovery writer. I do make outlines for every chapter, but I don't do story outlines because I found them to be counterproductive for my style of writing.
Oh.
So I have I'll write out an outline of every scene in a chapter before I write that chapter. But I don't do an outline of like a 10 chapter arc or the whole story because it evolves and changes so much that, like I said, I tried that with A Simple Act of Vengeance where I had an outline for 25 chapters. And I remember I opened up the Word document that I had my outline in after I had published, I think it was the third floor, the first year fight, with Quarrel.
Yeah.
And that was chapter 13. And I opened up my outline and I realized that I was like 11 chapters behind where I should have been. And at that point, you just say, well, this outline is useless. Like I'm obviously not following it. It has no relevance to the story that I'm currently telling.
Uh-huh.
And that's been the way that I've dealt with outlines throughout my time of writing. I can't seem to follow them.
How do you deal with plot holes? Since you don't outline, you might discover that you've basically created a gap, a plot hole in your story because of it. How do you deal with that?
Has that ever happened?
There was the channel.
I mean,
there was the thing with the timing that we had to.
Yes, yeah, that was an issue.
How do you
mostly
not protect yourself, but like how do you fix whenever something bad comes your way as a discovery writer? How do you deal with the pitfalls the discovery writing has?
I don't think about it until it comes up, and it comes up so rarely.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that the reason I don't have to worry about it is because I reread my work so much, which is something that until your story is finished and published, you should be rereading it all the time.
Yep.
But
that's the thing with fanfic. Like most people write and then publish before finishing the whole story. So sometimes you can't fix mistakes that you didn't see coming as you were writing.
Oh, exactly. And I mean, if you're rereading your own work, like, you can come up with like side plots a lot easier. Your characters feel more
genuine.
Yeah, and they just don't. I'm trying to think of the right word here. Like, if you always have their voice correct, if you're always rereading it, they don't ever act out of character or have it. That's it. That's the word. Which of us is the native speaker here?
Consistency is great. It's always something to aim for, especially as voice. Speaking of, how do you try for a certain voice for your characters, or do they come naturally? How do you come up with each character's voice and make them unique and distinct from one another?
It's conscious. I don't want anyone to be confused of who's talking, and I want characters to have their own sense of individuality. And if you're a writer and you want your character to have a specific and unique voice, create a backstory for them. And I'm not saying that you should include that in your story, because oftentimes it's irrelevant and has nothing to do with the plot of your story. But for yourself, think about who they are, what they've gone through, how they reacted to challenges and successes. And once you have an understanding of them as a person, then their voice comes naturally. I think about like Gabrielle from Subtle Acts of Sororicide, and she's a hot mess, and very unique and very individual. Probably like one of my best characters that I've made. And I don't feel that she's unrealistic, despite how it's essentially like a crack fic, but she's one of the most realistic characters I've made, in my opinion, because she's so relatable. Like, you should dislike her for how selfish and stupid and, lazy she is.
Yeah. But at the same time, you kind of feel for her. And you kind of want her to succeed. So it speaks to the quality of the writing, of the character writing, that she is someone you care for.
Yes.
Even despite every flaw she has.
Her flaws are why you care.
Yes, that's true. Bringing back a bit. Do you, as you're writing, do you research a lot, and what merits research for you in your stories?
I think that it depends on how people are as an author. It's a very individual thing, so I can't say what people should or shouldn't research. Myself, I research a lot of places, so if my characters are going somewhere, I'll go on Google Maps and look at satellite photos. I'll go to the website of that town and read the Wikipedia page. Overall, I think that there's an overemphasis on research, where there's this assumption that, like, it has to be completely true to life or else you're a bad writer. And I don't think that's necessarily like the case. Not every plot calls for extreme realism in every situation. And sometimes just the appearance of realism makes the story better. And I think about the meteor in A Simple Act of Vengeance, where you and I mean...
we spent hours. Maybe days, yeah. I think.
Absolutely. I mean, to the point where we were discussing actual physics, like down to like formulae of like falling objects and mass, and it just started to feel like, what am I doing? I'm writing a Harry Potter fanfic, and here I am talking about this. And so at that point I kind of thought, all right, like, this is counterproductive. I remember, I think you and I had a conversation where I said, how do I make this sound right? Like, it doesn't matter if it would actually happen, but if you're reading this story, like, I don't want you to think, wow, well, that would never happen. But at the same time, like, no one reading it, I did have one person reading it who actually messaged me and said, I'm an engineer and that's wrong. But besides that, nobody reading it thought, like, well, like, the mass and velocity ratios were off on that. It's fantasy. Like, it's more about the description and the event itself. Just make it, fake it till you make it with research.
Yeah, and the character reactions as well. That's what matters. You have way too many, it's a bit harsh, but you have several plot lines. And many more to come. How do you not get lost in the plots? How can you compartmentalize each and every one without losing yourself?
Part of it goes back to what I talked about with creating real characters. So, I don't confuse the Daphne in Wrath and Remorse with the Daphne in A Malignant Ruse, because they're two totally different people. Sure. And every story that I have, when I start a story, I have the A plot, like the main overarching conflict and plot line worked out in my head. So, every single story that I have, I know how the main plot ends. But the B plots and C plots and D plots, if you're talking about Wrath and Remorse, those pop up organically. So when I'm rereading things, which, also is like a callback to what we talked about before, like the B plots come up on their own, and I don't have to necessarily think about them as hard, because once they're established and I have the idea, I don't forget them. I may modify them, but or I may go in different directions. Like I was writing the next chapter of Subtle Acts of Sororicide this weekend, and I had written maybe like 1,200 words, and I went back yesterday morning and I reread what I had, and then I went back and reread the most recent chapter that I had published. And I thought, I don't like where this subplot is going. And so I deleted the 1,200 words and started over. Yeah, you just have to be willing to accept that sometimes your first idea may not be the best. And I mean, I don't know if that's really an answer to how I keep it straight. I don't have an answer. I just do.
That's okay. Bringing back a bit, when you finished your Sully one shot and you managed to edit and read in one go and without publishing and being able to fix anything that you thought you needed more, like you added another scene, you could toy with it. Do you prefer doing a whole thing in one go before publishing, or you don't mind that you publish chapter by chapter?
I think chapter by chapter is more effective for a larger cast, because the long shot with Sue Lee, it had really, I mean, 2, maybe 3 characters total. You had cameos from Hermione, cameos from Ron, Andromeda, Teddy, but for the most part, I mean, I feel like you could only say Harry, Sue Lee, and maybe Mandy were characters.
Yeah.
And I loved writing it, and it was great because I could, like, when I finished In Living Company, the Sue Lee fic, I thought to myself, like, this is what I should have done for Subtle Acts of Sororicide. Because that also was a smallish story. I don't think SAS will go past, 50,000 words. So I could have just done it all in one go. But at the same time, because Subtle Acts has a larger cast where, Teddy is a main character,
yep.
Fleur is a main character, Gabrielle, Harry, Victoire even. Teddy wasn't even supposed to be a big part of that story, and he's ended up becoming the main plot. So I think that chapter by chapter allows you the room to grow a story if you want to. If you're telling something simple, where there's not really any B plots, you have this story in mind, that's fine to shoot it out in one go. And I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was great doing that. But for something more complex, I actually do think that the episodic format is good because you have to build tension. Otherwise, I mean, you should build tension. Maybe people don't. But I want every chapter to end with people thinking, whoa, like, what's going to happen next?
Yep. Without being a cliffhanger all the time, because that's the worst thing possible.
Yes, I agree.
Of all your plots and stories, which one is your favorite and why?
Well, I said In Living Company is my best story, and I do believe that. I think that it's the best piece of fiction that I've written to this point, but Wrath and Remorse is my favorite. By now, every character in that story is essentially like an original character because I've changed them so much.
Different, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're
the
what,
past
like
isn't
7?
The same anymore.
Even the what?
Their past isn't the same.
Right. I mean, it's the story in the story's universe. So within the story, It's been like 9 years since A Simple Act of Vengeance started, and so everything is completely different. I loved the freedom of world building. I tried to make the magical world as alive as possible rather than just, British centric. And I've just had such a blast with the ensemble.
It's
where
so big. It's so huge.
It really is.
I tried explaining the plot for my friend, and it took me over an hour and a half of speaking, and I still didn't get to the half. That's how big it is. We talked before that you usually can separate characters because they're very different from one another, but most times Harry can be quite similar to one another in your fix, because at his core he's very unique. And how do you make it so each Harry is different enough, but it still is the Harry we know and love?
Well, the reason I write Harry-centric stories is because the audience has such a connection with him.
Yeah.
And so even in my stories where, it's completely AU, something like A Graceless Tandem, where Voldemort never existed, Harry's parents are alive, he was never in any danger until he finished Hogwarts, things like, it was a totally different person at that point.
Yep.
But you still want the audience to connect with him, and people are reading Harry Potter fan fiction because they want to read about Harry Potter. So I think that at a certain level, you can't if you make a Harry Potter where Harry is acting like Draco Malfoy or is, as
Ron.
like irreverent as Ron Weasley, then you've lost some of the spirit. And I think that's one of the criticisms that I actually agree with of a lot of the, the criticism of tropes, where people will talk about like the indie Harry tropes. And yeah, exactly. Independent Harry tropes. Which are, they say, oh, like Harry just like yells at everybody all the time. And it's very true.
He has 10 family names, and he owns the council or the Wizengamot or whatever.
Right, and like 10 wives, and all the gold in the world.
And goblins bow to him whenever he walks by, because he calls them by their names.
Right, no one's ever done that before.
Yeah, no, of course not.
But when you do that, the problem is that that's not Harry Potter anymore, because there's nothing about his character, his personality, that is remotely related to the story that people are reading fan fiction of. And so even when I make a completely AU story, I still want to include things like Harry's desire for family, Harry's desire for friends, like his sense of his loyalty, his sense of responsibility, where realistically, if you look at canon Harry Potter, like, there should be a lot more scenes of Harry yelling at everybody saying, I'm 13 years old. Like, what are you doing? I mean, really.
I'm just a kid.
Exactly. Like, there's this child that's, like, thrown into this war and put all this responsibilities put on him. And Harry, in the original stories, Harry almost never balks at that. He accepts it and takes up the mantle as of a hero. And I think that is integral to his character, no matter what situation he's placed in.
How would you go about if you wanted to write a dark Harry, but still retaining his core values? Do you think it's possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have written a dark Harry where he retains his values.
No. Sorry, I meant an actual evil one, not just like killing.
Oh,
him.
Okay.
Actual...
I'm sure it could be done. I think that I personally, as a writer, would very much struggle with it because it would feel too much, like I said, of where I'm making an original character and like slapping the Harry Potter label on it. Mm-hmm. Because I think to be like, quote unquote evil Harry, there has to be a certain element of joy in doing evil. And no matter how far Harry is pushed, I don't see it as very believable from if I were writing it. Keep in mind, like I know that there are fics out there and writers who can do things that I can't, just flat out, and so I'm not saying this can't be done, but for me, if you told me like, hey, I'll give you like $100 to write an Evil Harry story, I don't know that I could do it well.
Okay, that's interesting. It would definitely be hard. It's something I very rarely enjoy reading, and I can only think of maybe 2 that I enjoyed. How do you choose which pairing you want for each kind of Harry you write? And how do you come up with their personalities? Why do you think they match well? How do you decide what will match well?
In some ways, this is a very simple question, and in other ways, it's so complicated. So, I pick the pairings. Now, I would say, where I'm at now as a writer, I don't enjoy writing characters that have preconceived notions with the audience. And I think it was when I wrote my Harmony fic, Taming Destiny, I got so much negative feedback, not based on the story, but on
Hermione?
The way that Hermione was written, where people say, oh, like, Hermione is dating someone else at the start of this story? Like, I'm out. Or, wow, you made Hermione a total slut because she is intimate with the boyfriend in that story that she had been dating for, like, 4 years. And I thought, wow, like, this is, like, a really big turnoff for me as a writer, because people don't want to read stories about Harry and
Real
Hermione
characters.
getting together realistically. They just want to read, like, conflict-free, fix-it-fix, where Ron is, a mustache-twirling villain, and Dumbledore is, like, an old manipulator, and that's what the Harmony audience generally wants. And I think that, you had on, Firefawn, who said similar things about when she wrote Daphne. She got a lot of feedback from people who were just complaining that Daphne wasn't what they imagined in their head. And it's a really unfair thing for readers to do to writers. Because it's, if I say up front, hey, I'm writing a story here with characters that you've heard of, but they have different backstories and different pasts, and the world is different, you can't then turn around as a reader and say, wow, you really screwed up and the character is nothing like that. Because it kind of violates the rules that I told you at the start of the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in general, when I say, like, okay, I want to write a new story, I kind of can throw a dart at the wall and pick just a random character. So, like, Demelza Robbins. I went on to fanfiction.net.
I know you got tired as you were writing, but I love that one. It was so fun.
I mean, it is a fun story. I'll say that. But I just went and looked and I said, okay, like, I want a character that no one knows, and there was not a single story when I wrote that had tagged as the pairing Harry and Demelza.
That wasn't a Heron.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there were some where she figured in as, like, someone that, like, Harry, like, had sex with, but she wasn't a real character.
Yep.
So, in doing that, like, people could read that story and appreciate the story that I wrote, the interactions of the characters, the plot that I had developed, without any of their preconceived notions of, like, well, I just can't see Hermione doing that. Like, and that was so freeing as a writer for me to be able to say, oh God, like, finally, I don't have to worry about, like, these people who have spent 15 years loving a character, to the point that they can't separate, like, the words on the screen from their relationship with that character. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it's great that people, like, appreciate, creative work in that way, where they feel so strongly that they can't, the same way that I said I can't think of a way I could write an Evil Harry, people can't think of a way that they could read,
a different, like, Hermione or a
exactly
Ginny that isn't that doesn't love Quidditch or something like that.
Yes. So when I pick a pairing, that's how I start. I say, okay, well, this idea that I have, can I just insert an original character really with a name from canon? And if I can do that, I'm happy. If I can't, then I'm in trouble. So it's harder.
I guess that's why people latched on to Daphne at the start. Now she has a preconceived notion that the Ice Queen and stuff, but at the start she was basically a tabula rasa that people could use the name and write whatever they wanted, combined with the fact that she was in Slytherin, so you had that dynamic between Slytherin and Gryffindor. But
absolutely,
she was
Susan
essentially
Bones
that.
is the same way.
She was simply a name in the fandom. A nice name. I love the name Daphne, but that's neither here nor there. Speaking of making original characters, you started writing, or you decided to write an original fiction. How is that different from fanfic? And do you like doing it?
Original fiction is really hard. And I like it a lot because there's so much freedom. Everything that I just complained about 10 seconds ago does not apply.
Yep.
And so
the world is your oyster.
Exactly. I mean, I have total freedom to write whatever I want. The world can be whatever I want. And it's magnificent in that way. Mm-hmm. So creatively, it can't be beat. However, realistically, balancing your world building and your plot is extremely complicated. And in fan fiction, it is not a complication whatsoever because every single person that reads your fanfic knows the Harry Potter world. They wouldn't be reading your story otherwise.
Yep.
So I don't have to explain what this spell does, and I don't have to explain how magical schools or owls work.
But you also can't explain it in a info dumpy way, so it's doubly hard when you have to explain something in your own word.
Right. And I mean, also the fact that there's no built-in audience. So
True.
It's fan fiction is about telling a group of people who love a story. My story is going to let you recapture some of those feelings. Original fiction is about just getting people interested in your story, period.
In the first place. Yep.
And especially when you're writing fantasy, that is a very tall order. So I've had an easier time writing. I'm writing 2 original fictions right now. One is this grand fantasy epic that is extremely hard for me to write because of all the things I listed. And the other one is a more general romance that's set in relatively contemporary times, pre-COVID, of course, because who wants to live in the world that we live in right now?
Probably.
So that one is a lot easier to write because I don't have to explain to people, what a cell phone is or, what a hospital is. Whereas in the fantasy world, every time I'm writing, I'll write a paragraph and I'll think, well, wait, am I assuming that my reader is going to understand why people do things this way as opposed to how it's done in the real world? And then I just get lost in the world building, and it's a struggle to make it interesting in that regard.
Yeah, it's a big issue with world building. Some people love it so much that they lose themselves in it, and then they have no plot. Getting out of the whole original fiction, what are your favorite characters and pairings, and why? What makes you love them?
Luna Lovegood is my favorite character, hands down.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, I think she's adorable. I think she's very sweet and innocent, and at the same time, she has a way of understanding Harry that I don't think any other character in the series does. Mm-hmm. She sees him as a person, but she also can empathize rather than sympathize with the things that he's lost. And, when I read the series originally, I thought for sure Harry and Hermione were going to get together. Yeah. Because Hermione is the only female character that's given any sort of depth by J.K. Rowling. And I also think, looking back now at the canon material, that Luna would have been a much better fit than Hermione or Ginny, because of all the things that I just listed. She has this like whimsy about her that reminds you of the positive things about the magical world, whereas, for most of Harry's experiences, it was like trauma and terror.
Yep.
So he needs something that's like innocent and sweet and kind. Yeah. However,
it's kindness. I think it's the biggest defining trait that Luna has.
Yes,
more
absolutely.
Than anything else.
As far as like what I read pairings, if I'm gonna go onto fanfiction.net and pick a story by someone that I don't know, it will probably be Harmony. And that's mostly because, every pairing has bad stories, first of all. So there are terrible Harmony fics out there, but there are also terrible stories in every pairing. And the reason I would say I generally find what I'm looking for in Harmony more than other pairings is because when writers create a romance around Harry and Hermione, it's usually based around things like their experiences together, their similarities, their similar backgrounds, the time that they spend together, and those are very believable reasons to fall in love with someone.
Yep.
And I appreciate that within that pairing, that's often the path that is taken, and it's realistic. So
without
I don't want
like a marriage contract that you see the person and you're instantly in love with them.
Yeah, and it's funny because a lot of the stories that I write, the romances that I write, are people that don't necessarily deserve romantic success. Like Daphne in A Malignant Ruse is not a good person at the start of the story.
No. Definitely.
And Gabrielle still isn't a very good person in Subtle Acts. But when I'm reading, it's hard to find stories because people don't advertise up front like, hey, like I wrote a character with flaws and they're going to be redeemed and you'll be happy at the end. So it's hard to find stories that fit that. Whereas in Harmony, like I can just go, search through and find something that feels like it's written by someone that's been in love before.
Yep. It feels genuine.
Oh, and I should say also, this, there are not a lot of fanfics that I've read that like caused me to feel like real heavy emotion. And two of the ones that spring to mind, like if you were to ask me like, wow, like what is a fanfic that you read that, like actually brought tears to your eyes and like you had so much emotion from it? I would say like Vox Corporis by Misanthropic.
Yeah, many people praise this one. I never read it.
It's probably the best love story of any Harry Potter fanfic that's ever been made. Any hetero, because I haven't read any slash, so I don't know what those are like. And the other one would be Live Forever by Petrificus Samwatus. Which was just like such a beautiful story, and it had so much emotion in it. And so
I love that one.
I find that Harmony writers are able to kind of have that realism, whereas when I read a lot of Hafni stories, it'll be a good story and I'll genuinely enjoy it, but there's never a moment where I like get choked up and I think like, oh my gosh, like I'm just like overwhelmed by this.
I don't know. I got really stressed reading about your Daphne reference remorse. Poor girl. Jesus Christ.
Or everyone in that story.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus. Well, yeah, I get what you mean. I'm very softy as far as writing. Many things brings me to tears. when I read stuff. So that isn't actually a very good measure for me. Because, like, I cried watching Pokemon. I'm not a good person to judge.
Hey, anime can hit you hard.
Yeah, most definitely. For sure. There's one that I've been trying to make people watch called, I think it's The Sound of Silence. No.
Yes. I have that in my Netflix queue.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's beautiful. Everyone should watch it because it's the single best redemption arc that I have ever seen. And it's heartbreakingly beautiful. Moving away from emotional stuff. You mentioned you want to write original stuff. Obviously, you started writing 2 stories by now. Do you see yourself as a writer in the long term, or this is only an extra hobby, like you do something on the side because it's fun for you, or do you actually want to become a pro?
Ideally, I would love to write for a living. But no matter what, to be a writer, to be an author, like a professional writer, it requires so much luck. If you look at like J.K. Rowling or even someone like Tom Clancy, who I read Tom Clancy's books when I was a kid. My father was in the military. I was really into like the military stuff when I was a kid. Grew up on military bases.
I like Tom Clancy a lot.
Me too. Like his stories are fun, and Jack Ryan, his main character, is a good character. But I went back this last year and I reread 3 of his books, and they were not good books. Like they weren't good writing. And I thought to myself, like, wow, like this guy was one of the most successful authors in my lifetime. Everyone, even if you've never read his books or seen the movies based on his books, you know who he is.
Yep.
Exactly. And, J.K. Rowling, who is the most successful author of my lifetime,
and
she was
probably
rejected
everyone else.
How many times?
Sorry, what?
She was rejected how many times before she got it published?
I don't know, 20, 30. She mentioned something like that. That was so
it
many.
Requires so much luck to be a professional writer.
Finding your correct agent and hoping the agent will help you get the correct publishing. It's very lucky by itself.
So, I mean, you're right. Will I keep writing in the future? I honestly believe I will, because it turns out I'm actually pretty good at writing. Sure. Not to be immodest, but
no, for sure.
But whether or not how much I write will likely depend on the sort of success that I can find.
Okay. Bringing back a bit about tropes. Is there anything you wish there was more of, as far as tropes and characters, or even pairings in fanfic?
There's one thing that I wish there was more of, and this is like such a general thing, but really fanfiction it skews young. Most of the creators are younger, and so I forgive this, but it drives me crazy, and it's why I don't read as much fanfiction as I used to. And it's 2 words: character development. It's the biggest problem. People can complain about tropes all day long, but tropes, like we talked about before, aren't necessarily bad.
No.
And every story has them. But having believable characters that act like real people, like that is vanishingly rare in Harry Potter fanfiction. Characters should be human. They shouldn't be mannequins just wandering through a plot line. And it doesn't matter how creative you are. It doesn't matter how original your plot is, how many twists and turns you have. If your characters are bland and flat, your story sucks. So 100%. This is such a huge problem. Characters have to grow. They have to be flawed. They have to evolve and change within a story. Everyone reads fiction not so we can see the plot resolved. We read fiction so that we can see the character deal with the plot.
So my question is this: character driven?
Go ahead.
Or plot driven?
Character driven or plot driven? I mean, the two are, you cannot delineate between them. Because let's say you have a completely character-driven story, right?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that there's no outside or internal conflict. And a plot is a character meeting, facing, and resolving a conflict. That is what a plot is.
Mm-hmm.
So even character-driven stories have conflict and plot. Plot-driven stories have characters that are dealing with the plot. And so I can see the
But which one
question.
do you prefer? That's my...
Oh, I see. I thought you meant like which one is better.
No. I know. That's okay.
Which one do I prefer? I guess I like writing character-driven.
Okay.
Not necessarily. Like, I think that Wrath and Remorse and A Simple Act of Vengeance will probably be like my most external plot device of all my stories.
But to be fair, most of the things that happened was because of Harry himself, so it's kind of character driven.
Right. He's a little boy, and in A Simple Act of Vengeance, and so he makes mistakes that kids make, and does stupid things that have real world repercussions. But that I much prefer something like In Living Company, or Subtle Acts of Sororicide, where the character, or even A Malignant Ruse, while I'm not super thrilled about that story, I do like how almost the whole story, almost the whole story though, is just Daphne like having to come to terms with the fact that the way she's lived her life to this point,
and growing as a person.
Yeah, it wasn't good, and so she has to change, and changing is really, really hard to do.
Especially as a teenage girl in a world where she basically had to forgo all of her friends to do so.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's amazing. That's why I love it, because of the character development that you had with Daphne. Not the setting itself. Although I love the setting, it's basically because of Daphne. And I love half-name Fick, so there's that. Come on, I love it. What can I say? And more characters or pairings. You mentioned tropes. That you want more character development, but is there anything specific that you wish there was more of?
Honestly, no. Like when I read something, like I used to really want to see creative magical combat, because that was a big reason why I started writing Harry Potter fan fiction specifically, because I thought to myself, it's so easy to come up with like really like exciting and like thrilling battles, and everyone just has wizards fighting like they're like 16th century musketeers. Like, it's boring. So I used to really want that. Like, I wanted to have like an action-packed fic. Like, the original Harry Potter series, it takes place during a war, and you never would know it. It has the most pathetic action sequences of any war fic. Like,
the only mildly good one is in book 5, I think.
I agree. And that specifically only the battle between Dumbledore and Voldemort.
Yep.
Like, the whole Department of Mysteries battle is dull.
Running around and throwing spells.
Yeah. So I used to look for that, and now honestly, I enjoy reading good character development pairings. I still don't really enjoy reading slash, which I sort of wish that wasn't the case, because I'm sure that the majority of Harry Potter fanfics are slash. And I must be missing out on some really magnificent writing. But it just doesn't really appeal to me. It's not something that I would actively seek out during my leisure time, which is the only time that I read. So, I just kind of accept that that's like a blind spot that I will have. But yeah, I'm not someone that's going to say, I really wish there were more good political fics, or I wish that there was, more Harry Luna. Like, no, like I'm I'm happy reading good writing.
Whatever it is. Okay. Who has helped you the most with your writing career, and who is your biggest inspiration, both in the fan fiction and the traditional literature? I stumble with this word every single time. Traditional literature. How do you say it?
Literature. It's okay.
Literature. Literature. In traditional lit. That's
there
better.
You go. So you've been probably the biggest help. And it's funny because you can go back and look. You came on, I want to say your first chapter that you edited, I think, was 33 in A Simple Act of Vengeance. 31.
Yep.
But you came on the chapter before, which was 30.
Yep.
And I can identify like a shift. And maybe I think readers could too. The story just improves monumentally.
I'd have to reread everything because it's been so many years. I feel like it's been 1 year, but like, it feels in my head so many years ago.
But you've been a huge help.
So many things happen with Harry, though.
Yeah. You let me bounce ideas off you. You're very supportive, but you're also honest. I think that anyone out there who wants to be involved in the writing process but doesn't want to put the time into writing should read your blog about being a beta, because
I should write more. It's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, well, you are just the best at it.
Thank you.
And so that's made such a huge difference. I also
You're delusional,
would say,
but thank you.
Well, Wake Fan and Mr. Omega 573, both of them have been like really helpful. They both also are fanfic authors. Mr. Omega writes Magics of the Arcanist, Unspeakable Mysteries.
Yep.
And Wake Fan wrote Dance of Death and Casting Shadows, both of those authors write.
Weird. Like they're sequel and prequel at the same time, written at the same time. So like, I don't know how he does it.
I know, it was impressive. But they also, I talked before about combat. Both of them write some of the most exciting magical combat I've seen. Mm-hmm. Not just in Harry Potter. Like it's really like thrilling. So they're great. My Discord channel is an amazing group of people. They've never let me down when I need help or feedback. I want to specifically mention Umbrum, UDM, Trickster, Lovesync, and Luke. I could go on. There's about a dozen readers that really they are the reason I kept writing after A Simple Act of Vengeance, because all I wanted to do was write that one story. I wanted to write, the meteor scene, and I thought like, okay, I'll get back to my real life. But people like Things Can Be Two Things, B.D. Williams,
Look at you.
Long Self-Indulgent Reviews, and Hot Dog 101, like those guys kept me writing. So that's made all the difference. As for
biggest
inspirations, I mean, fanfic, I guess I wanted to recapture like that emotion in Vox Corporis. Mm-hmm. So that's always kind of been my standard that I have not yet met. Because when you read it, you'll understand, but it really is like an amazing love story that's like so full of emotion.
Everyone praises the hell out of it. I should probably read it.
And in real life, there's a lot of great stories. For me personally, when I was a kid, there was a game called Wing Commander. And it was like a space flying game where, you're like in the cockpit and you like fight aliens and stuff. And there was a series of books. Wait, what?
Like River Raid from the Atari.
No. This is more modern than that. I think
okay.
more like Descent or something like that. Descent Free Space kind of.
Okay. But
it's they made a series of books that were like the backstory of that game universe.
Oh,
and there was a book called Action Stations, which is really just a complete retelling of Pearl Harbor, but in the future in space.
That's gotta be amazing.
It was by this guy, William R. Forshton, who he wrote a bunch of Wing Commander books, and he was also a ghostwriter for several like right-wing politicians' memoirs. I don't know. But he wrote some original fiction that never went anywhere. So he like as an adult, I've looked him up, and I feel like here's this guy who writes pretty well, who never made it with his own writing, so he essentially did professional fan fiction with the Wing Commander stuff, or he did ghost writing for politicians, and he had like a pretty long career as a writer, and I think there's nothing to be ashamed of with that. And that book, Action Stations, like anyone who likes like war or military history, there's like a lot of really like powerful moments of like sacrifice and nobility. And so I think that was probably the single biggest influence on the way I write. Obviously there's been a lot more. There's one more thing. You said like about like what helped me the most. And I rattled off like 30 people who like review my stories or who like talk to me about my stories and other authors and stuff like that. But you and I in the past have talked a lot about like my major gripe with this fandom, and it would be like the lack of community among creators. Everybody has stories about like bad reviews, but in the end, like a stranger on the internet isn't required to like my stuff or say nice things about it. But it's much more problematic that like the people who go through the same things that I do, who like write these stories within this fandom, who interact with the same readers, they do nothing to support like other writers. And that's why I value the authors on my Discord server so much, because we all have each other's backs, we promote each other, we help with the writing process, and that makes all the difference. And I would really encourage like any writer out there that's listening, like you're not too good for that, and you should be doing that more.
That's good. I agree. What would you say it's your one thing that has influenced you as a person, whatever it may be, a fanfic, a book, a movie, anything, to the point where your life has changed completely, and why do you love that?
Probably there's a book called On the Road by Jack Kerouac. He was a beat writer from the 1950s. And it's a very famous book in the United States. I don't know if it's internationally well known, so I don't know if you've heard of it.
I don't recall it.
Okay, so like Jack Kerouac, I'm sure anyone who's living in the USA who grew up like knows who he is, but maybe hasn't read him. He's famous for he writes in a stream of consciousness. So in On the Road, which is his most famous book, it's about him like wandering around the U.S. almost like a hobo, but him and his friends like partying and like stealing gasoline to drive across the country. He'll have sentences that last like 7 pages, and it's just it's just him like spewing out stream of consciousness where it's wild. But that book, I read it when I was probably 17, and in my life I moved 11 times before I was 16. As an adult, I've lived in 9 different states in the United States. I'm always moving. I've never been one place for longer than 5 years in my life. I've never lived in a single place longer than 5 years.
Wow. And
that book is all about like the power of like being like. And On the Road is about him searching for somewhere to belong. And that definitely changed my life. And yeah, I guess that's what I've also been looking for.
That's awesome. I love that. If you could give our listeners some advice about becoming writers, what would it be? What do you think is the best thing to focus on as a novice writer?
So anybody that says I want to write, what would you tell me? I would give them 3 pieces of advice. The first thing, focus on your characters. Make them real people. Make them imperfect. Allow them to have goals and motivations and flaws and interests. Because remember that the most boring person alive on Earth is still incredibly complex.
And they are also their own protagonists in their own life.
Absolutely, yeah. Next, conflict. After characters, conflict is by far the most important thing.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be like world-ending stakes. Like if we don't solve this problem, like the world is going to end, or this evil guy is going to conquer, kill everybody. Like it doesn't have to be that. It could be finding the right outfit or making it to dinner on time. Like that is conflict. But conflict has got to be present in your story, because if it isn't there, you do not have a story.
You do not have tension.
And the last thing I would tell everybody, not just writers, but anybody that is doing something creative, love your own work. Tell the story that you want to read, not what you think other people will like, because if you don't love your own work, why the hell should anyone else? So be proud of what you've done, accept that, maybe it's not perfect, maybe you'll do better next time, but still love your own work.
That's awesome. I love that. Do you have any recommendation? Stories, either books or fanfics?
I mean, I recommend every author that's on my Discord server.
The list is long.
Yeah, it is. They're very creative people. As far as like books, gosh,
Well, you mentioned On the Road.
On the Road, anything by Douglas Copeland, who also I have ugly cried after reading every single one of his books. Eleanor Rigby is his best one. He's a Canadian author. I bet Salient would know him. And he's very, very evocative, like very powerful. So, but I think that's what I can think of at the moment. There's always so many things. Like in 20 minutes, I'll probably be like, oh, damn it. Like, why didn't I say this? But, I'm content with those as my recommendations.
That's okay. Well, thank you, Frickles, for chatting with me today. And thank you, listeners, for sticking around. Next time, I will be interviewing Asphodel Rose 87, and I hope to see you all again. Keep reading and review an author you love. You could really make their day or even make a new friend. Thank you, Pickles.
Thank you very much. I loved it. Have a great one.
You too. Bye-bye.